Welcome to Whispering Willows Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain arrived at Baker Street the way it always did in October, without fanfare, without warning, simply present, as if it had been falling forever, and would continue long after London forgot to notice. It tapped against the windows of 221B with the persistence of an unwanted guest, who knows, somehow, that they'll be let in eventually. The sound was gentle, rhythmic, the kind that makes thought slow and circular. Each drop a small petition for attention that the mind answers without quite realizing it has done so. Inside, the sitting room held its own weather. The coal fire burned with that particular orange glow that belongs only to autumn afternoons, when daylight gives up early and warmth becomes a currency more valuable than gold. Smoke from the fire mingled with smoke from Sherlock Holmes's pipe, creating layers in the air. Grey meeting blue meeting amber, a visible archaeology of the room's breathing. The scent was complex. Coal and tobacco, yes, but also old books dampening slightly in the humidity. The faint metallic tang of the rain itself seeping through window frames, and underneath it all, the ghost of Mrs. Hudson's morning tea, bergamot clinging to porcelain like a pleasant memory. Holmes sat in his usual chair, the one positioned to catch both firelight and whatever weak illumination the window might offer. Today, it offered almost none. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, a position Watson had learned to recognize as either deep contemplation or profound boredom. The two states looked identical from the outside, distinguished only by whether Holmes would subsequently solve something brilliant, or do something reckless. The detective's grey eyes followed the rain's path down the glass, with an attention that seemed far too intense for mere weather-watching, as if each droplet carried information, secrets trailing behind it, like wet footprints. Watson sat across from him, journal open on his lap, pen poised in that eternal moment before words arrive. He'd been trying to capture the essence of their last case, the matter of the stolen correspondence and the blackmailing parrot, an affair both ridiculous and surprisingly dangerous. But the rain kept interrupting his thoughts, not unpleasantly, just insistently, the way it does when it wants you to stop working and simply listen. His military posture had softened over the years at Baker Street. He sat, now with one leg crossed over the other, comfortable in a way that his younger self, fresh from Afghanistan, would have considered dangerously casual. The room around them was a study in organized chaos, though Watson sometimes suspected the organization was visible only to Holmes. Books lay open at odd angles, some stacked 3 deep on side tables, their pages marked with everything from proper bookmarks to spent matches to what appeared to be a playing card. The 3 of spades, specifically, though Watson had never asked why. Papers covered the desk in what Holmes insisted was a system, though it looked more like a paper storm had passed through and decided to settle permanently. The chemistry apparatus in the corner caught the firelight and threw it back in strange colours, the beakers and retorts like a glasswork city, miniature and mysterious. The afternoon had that peculiar quality of timelessness that rainy days impose on the world. It could have been 3 o'clock or 5. The grey light refused to commit. London, beyond their windows, was muffled, softened, the usual cacophony of hooves and wheels and voices reduced to suggestion rather than certainty. Somewhere out there, the city churned on, vendors hawking goods, in voices gone hoarse with damp, hansoms splashing through puddles that reflected sky and stone in equal measure, ladies lifting their skirts just so to navigate streets where Victorian engineering met Victorian mud in an endless, losing battle. Baker Street itself was quieter than usual. Most sensible people had decided this was an afternoon for staying wherever they already were. The few who passed below the window did so quickly, hunched against the rain, their umbrellas tilted forward like shields against an enemy that attacked from above. Holmes watched one such figure pause at the corner, adjust their collar, then surrender to the inevitable, and simply walk on. Rain be damned. He smiled slightly. There was something honest about that surrender, something he appreciated. Watson cleared his throat, the sound small in the rain-hushed room. "Do you suppose," he began, then paused, reconsidering his question even as he asked it, "that the rain affects crime rates? Less activity in weather like this, I should think." Holmes stirred, a slight movement that suggested consciousness returning from wherever it had wandered. "An interesting supposition, Watson. One would think so, wouldn't one? And yet—" He gestured vaguely toward the window with his pipe, trailing smoke. "The rain doesn't stop need, doesn't stop desperation. It merely makes it wetter." His eyes crinkled slightly at his own small joke. "Though I grant you, the opportunistic pickpocket likely takes the day off. No profit in sodden pockets and alert, miserable crowds." "Quite," Watson agreed, and returned to his journal, where the parrot still waited to be memorialized in prose. The fire popped softly, sending up a small shower of sparks that lived briefly and died beautifully. Mrs. Hudson could be heard downstairs, moving about her kitchen with the comfortable sounds of domestic routine, the clink of china, the soft thud of a cupboard door, the brief rush of water from a tap. These sounds formed the heartbeat of Baker Street, the rhythm beneath all other rhythms, reliable as the rain, but warmer, human. It was into this particular species of quiet, not silence, but the layered hush of rain and fire and distant domesticity, that the knock came at the front door. Both men heard it. Both registered it. Neither moved immediately. Visitors were common enough at 221B, but visitors in this weather were either desperate or determined, and sometimes both. Holmes tilted his head slightly, listening not just to the knock itself, but to what followed. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hall below, the creak of the door, the low murmur of voices, one male, one familiar. Watson saw the recognition cross Holmes's face before he himself had placed the voice. "Lestrade," Holmes said, not quite a question. "In this weather?" Watson closed his journal. "Must be urgent." But Holmes shook his head slowly, a curious expression settling over his features. "No, not urgent." Note the cadence of his speech, measured, apologetic even. "He's not bringing us a case, Watson. He's seeking—" Holmes paused, searching for the word. "Refuge." And indeed, moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the sitting-room door with Inspector Lestrade behind her, and the inspector was quite spectacularly wet. Water dripped from the hem of his overcoat in a steady percussion, pooling on Mrs. Hudson's clean floor in a way that made her sigh, the particular sigh of landladies everywhere, who know they'll be mopping later. His hat, a sensible bowler that had seen better, drier days, was clutched in one hand, releasing its own small waterfall. His moustache drooped with moisture, giving his normally stern face a rather mournful, basset hound quality. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the tired warmth of a man who'd been fighting the weather and lost honourably. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Lestrade!" Watson was already on his feet, gesturing toward the fire. "Good Lord, man, you're soaked through. Come in, come in." Holmes rose more slowly, but his grey eyes were bright with something that might have been pleasure. "Inspector, what a delightfully miserable afternoon for a visit. Mrs. Hudson, would you be so kind as to bring tea, and perhaps something stronger, given the circumstances?" Mrs. Hudson, who had already anticipated this request, and had been on her way to the kitchen, nodded with the satisfied air of someone whose competence is being publicly acknowledged. "Right away, Mr. Holmes, and Inspector Lestrade, do leave that coat by the fire, or you'll catch your death." Lestrade obeyed, moving into the room with the careful steps of a man aware he's tracking water across someone else's floor and feeling guilty about it. He shrugged out of the overcoat, which seemed to have absorbed approximately half the Thames, and draped it over the back of a chair positioned at a respectful distance from the fire. Too close, and it would steam unpleasantly. Too far, and it would stay sodden. He'd calculated the exact right distance with the precision that made him, despite Holmes's occasional jibes, a rather good detective. "I was passing," Lestrade said, which was obviously untrue. No one simply passed by Baker Street in this weather unless they were specifically aiming for it. "And thought I might stop in, if it's inconvenient." "Sit down, Lestrade," Holmes interrupted, but gently gesturing to Watson's abandoned chair. "You look as though you've been swimming in your clothes. Did you walk all the way from Scotland Yard?" "Near enough." Lestrade settled into the chair with a grateful exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. Hansom driver took one look at the weather and decided he'd rather wait out the worst of it. Can't blame him. The streets are rivers. Watson resumed his own seat, studying their visitor with the clinical eye that never quite left him. Physician's instincts layered over friendship's concern. Lestrade looked tired, not the acute exhaustion of a man who'd missed one night's sleep, but the deeper weariness that accumulates over weeks, months, years of dealing with London's darker impulses. The lines around his eyes had deepened since Watson had last really looked at him, and there was grey now at his temples that definitely hadn't been there last Christmas. "Difficult week?" Watson asked. Lestrade laughed, short and sharp. "Difficult year, more like. Though I suppose they're all difficult, aren't they? Comes with the territory." He looked around the familiar room as if seeing it properly for the first time in ages. "You've rearranged." "Have we?" Holmes glanced around, genuinely puzzled. "The skull. It was on the mantelpiece. Now it's on the bookshelf." "Ah." Holmes waved his pipe dismissively. Mrs. Hudson objected to it, grinning at visitors. Said it was unwelcoming. I argued that any visitor unwelcomed by a skull was probably too delicate for our line of work, but she has her ways of winning arguments. "She does indeed," Lestrade agreed, and something in his voice suggested long experience with formidable women having their ways. The rain continued its patient work against the windows, and the fire settled deeper into its coals, glowing rather than blazing now, radiating heat without the distraction of flame. The room was growing warmer with 3 bodies in it, the temperature rising to that perfect degree where consciousness goes soft around the edges, where thought becomes less urgent, and the present moment expands to fill all available space. Mrs. Hudson returned with tea, a proper service, china that actually matched, which meant she approved of the inspector's visit, and a decanter of brandy with 3 glasses. She poured for each of them with practiced efficiency, adding brandy to Lestrade's tea without asking, a measure of medicinal intent. He accepted it with a nod that was almost a bow, cradling the cup in both hands to warm his fingers. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. You're a saint." "I'm a landlady," she corrected, but smiled as she said it. "And you're dripping on my floor, so drink that quickly and warm up properly." She departed, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to follow her, a small rebellion against the masculine fog of tobacco and old books. For a few moments the 3 men simply sat, drinking tea, listening to rain, existing in that particular form of companionable silence that only forms between people who've shared danger and tedium in roughly equal measure. They'd known each other, these 3, for years now, had stood together in dark alleys and bright courtrooms, had puzzled over evidence and celebrated solutions, had disagreed and reconciled, and disagreed again in the endless dance of professional colleagues who'd become, almost despite themselves, friends. Lestrade took a long sip of his brandy-laced tea and sighed again, this time with something closer to contentment. Colour was returning to his cheeks, the pinched look around his eyes easing slightly. "I don't suppose," he said, voice casual in the way that signals a question that's been waiting to be asked. "You remember the Ashworth case?" Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. "The Ashworth case. You'll need to be more specific, Inspector. There have been at least 3 families of that name involved in matters of interest over the past decade." "The heirloom," Lestrade clarified. 7 years ago, maybe 8, family brooch went missing. Suspicion fell on the new parlour maid. I handled it myself. Fairly straightforward matter, or so I thought at the time. Watson frowned, searching his memory. "I don't recall you mentioning it." "No reason you would have. It was before your time, Doctor, or at least before you were chronicling Mr. Holmes's adventures for posterity." There was no bitterness in Lestrade's voice, just statement of fact. "And Holmes wasn't involved. I solved it myself." Recovered the brooch, the maid confessed. Everyone went home satisfied. "Except?" Holmes prompted, because there was clearly an except hovering in the air, visible as the pipe smoke. Lestrade smiled, a curious expression, half rueful, and half something else. "Except I've been thinking about it lately. Can't say why. Perhaps it's the rain. Makes a man reflective, doesn't it? All this water, all this grey." He paused, watching the fire. "And I've been wondering, well, whether I got it right." The room seemed to lean in slightly, the way spaces do when a story is about to be told. Holmes settled deeper into his chair, fingers returning to their steepled position, but his attention was fully present now, grey eyes sharp despite the drowsy warmth. Watson felt himself adjusting position too, the journal forgotten, because he knew this moment, knew the particular quality of quiet that preceded revelation. Outside, London drowned softly in October rain, but inside 220 CB Baker Street, 3 men sat by firelight, and Inspector Lestrade was about to tell them a story about a case he'd solved 7 years ago, or thought he'd solved. And something in the way he said it suggested that perhaps solving and understanding were not quite the same thing after all. The afternoon stretched ahead, measured not in hours, but in words, in the slow unfurling of memory, in the gentle unpicking of certainty. The rain would fall, the fire would burn, and over tea and brandy and pipe smoke, the truth, or something closer to it, would emerge from the past, where it had been waiting, patient as autumn weather, for someone to finally ask the right questions. The tea settled them into a deeper stillness, the kind that comes when warmth spreads from the centre outward, and the body remembers what comfort feels like. Lestrade held his cup with both hands still, though his fingers had long since thawed, as if the porcelain itself had become a talisman against the weather beyond the windows. The rain had found its rhythm now, no longer the hesitant tapping of its arrival, but a steady drumming that filled the spaces between words, between breaths, a metronome set to the tempo of an English autumn determined to announce itself properly. Holmes had lit a fresh pipe, the previous one having burned down to ash during their silence. The new smoke rose in a slow spiral, catching the firelight as it climbed toward the ceiling, where it would join the accumulated haze of 1,000 previous conversations, 1,000 other afternoons, much like this one. There was something ritualistic about it, the lighting of tobacco, the first draw, the careful cultivation of ember. Watson recognized it as one of Holmes's thinking processes, a physical action that accompanied the mental gears beginning to turn. "Tell us," Holmes said finally, and it was less command than invitation, his voice carrying that particular gentleness he reserved for moments when someone was working up the courage to reveal something they weren't quite certain should be revealed. Lestrade smiled, glancing between them, and there was affection in it, the worn, comfortable affection of men who'd seen each other at their worst and remained anyway. "You'll think me foolish, perhaps, getting bothered by an old case, one that was settled years ago, but it's been niggling at me, as things do when you can't quite put your finger on what's wrong." "Nothing foolish about it," Watson offered, leaning forward slightly. "I find myself thinking about old cases from my army days sometimes, patients I treated, decisions I made. One wonders, doesn't one, whether things might have gone differently." "Exactly that, Doctor, exactly that." Lestrade took another sip of his tea, the brandy working its warm magic beneath the bergamot. The Ashworth case wasn't dramatic. No murders, no grand conspiracies, just a family brooch gone missing and a household in distress. The sort of thing that happens in every respectable home in London, probably once a month if we're being honest about human nature. The fire popped softly, sending up another small constellation of sparks. Outside, a hansom clattered past, its horses' hooves making a wet, muffled sound against the soaked cobblestones, the driver no doubt cursing the weather and the fare who'd required transport in it. The sound faded quickly, absorbed by the rain, leaving the room to its own quiet symphony of domestic sounds, the settle of coals, the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, the whisper of Watson's sleeve against the arm of his chair as he adjusted position. The Ashworths were, are, I suppose, if they're still about, a respectable family. Not wealthy by the standards of Mayfair, but comfortable enough. A townhouse in Bloomsbury, staff of 5, the usual arrangements. Mr. Ashworth worked in banking, something to do with colonial investments, the particulars of which I never fully grasped. Mrs. Ashworth was the sort of woman who took her social obligations very seriously, calling cards and tea parties and committee work for charitable causes, all the machinery of respectability that keeps a certain class of London running. Holmes nodded slightly, eyes half closed, but Watson knew that expression. He was constructing the scene in his mind, building the Ashworth household from Lestrade's words, like an architect working from verbal blueprints. Every detail would be filed away, cross-referenced with his extensive mental catalogue of London's social strata, its households and hierarchies. They had 3 children, Lestrade continued, though 2 were already grown and married off by the time of the incident. The youngest daughter, Margaret, was 19 then. Pleasant girl, from what I gathered, though nervous. She'd recently become engaged to a young solicitor, which was the whole reason for the brooch business in the first place. How so? Watson asked. Family heirloom, you see, passed down through the maternal line, mother to daughter, for 3 generations. Rather lovely thing, actually. Gold filigree work, Victorian craftsmanship at its finest, with a small cluster of garnets at the centre. Not enormously valuable in monetary terms, perhaps £50 if you sold it, but the sentimental worth was considerable. Mrs. Ashworth had worn it at her own engagement announcement, and her mother before her. The plan was for young Margaret to wear it at the formal dinner announcing her betrothal. The picture was forming now, visible in the warm air between them. Watson could see it. The Bloomsbury townhouse with its proper facade, its careful gardens, its brass fixtures polished weekly by servants who knew their livelihoods depended on such attentions. Inside, a family navigating the complex choreography of Victorian social advancement, where a daughter's marriage was both personal joy and strategic manoeuvre, where heirlooms carried the weight of continuity, of belonging to something larger than oneself. The brooch was kept in Mrs. Ashworth's dressing room, Lestrade said, in a locked jewellery box, which was itself kept in a locked drawer of her vanity. She was particular about such things, cautious. The keys lived on her person during the day, under her pillow at night. Very few people had access to that room unsupervised. The usual suspects, then, Holmes murmured. Lady's maid, housemaid, perhaps the daughter herself. Just so, though Margaret had no need to steal what would shortly be hers anyway. Mrs. Ashworth's lady's maid had been with the family for 15 years, completely trusted, references impeccable, which left. Lestrade paused, and something flickered across his face. Was it guilt? Uncertainty. The new parlour maid. Girl named Annie Fletcher. She'd only been in service with the Ashworths for 3 months. Watson felt something tighten in his chest, the familiar discomfort that came whenever he heard stories about servants accused of theft. He'd seen it too often, the immediate suspicion that fell upon those whose poverty made them vulnerable, whose lack of social standing meant their word carried no weight against their employers. Holmes, he noticed, had gone very still, the kind of stillness that meant he was listening not just to the words, but to everything around them. Tone, hesitation, the things Lestrade wasn't quite saying. The rain intensified briefly, a gust of wind throwing it harder against the windows, and all 3 men glanced toward the sound instinctively, as if the weather itself wanted to participate in the conversation. Then it settled again, back to its steady rhythm, and Lestrade picked up the thread of his story. The brooch went missing 2 days before the engagement dinner. Mrs. Ashworth discovered it when she went to retrieve it for Margaret to try on with her gown. Absolute panic, as you might imagine. The house was turned upside down, every room searched, every drawer emptied. I was called in that same evening. Mr. Ashworth had connections at Scotland Yard, pulled strings to get immediate attention. Can't say I blamed him. The social embarrassment alone would have been considerable if Margaret couldn't wear the family brooch at her own engagement announcement. "And you suspected the parlour-maid immediately?" Holmes asked, and his tone was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Not immediately," Lestrade said, and there was a defensive note creeping in now, the instinct of a professional justifying his methods. "I interviewed everyone in the household first. Standard procedure. But certain facts, well, they pointed in a particular direction." He shifted in his chair, settling deeper, and Watson noticed how the warmth of the room had fully restored him now. The earlier pinched tiredness had eased from his face, replaced by the alert expression of a man back in familiar territory, recounting investigative steps that had made perfect sense at the time. Outside, London continued its sodden existence, but here, in the amber glow of Baker Street, they were constructing another London, another time, a household 7 years gone, where a brooch had vanished and a girl's fate had hung in the balance. Annie Fletcher was 18 years old, Lestrade continued, fresh from the countryside, Dorset, I believe. She'd come to London seeking work after her father died and the family farm failed. Common enough story, sadly. Too many mouths to feed, eldest daughter sent to the city to lighten the burden and send money home. She'd found a position with the Ashworths through a registry office. No personal references, but decent enough credentials from a previous short-term placement. Watson was building his own picture now. A girl barely more than a child, thrust into the bewildering machinery of a London household, trying to navigate customs and expectations utterly foreign to her rural upbringing. The gap between Dorset and Bloomsbury might as well have been the distance between continents. Different languages, different rules, different worlds entirely. She had access to Mrs. Ashworth's dressing room, Lestrade said. Part of her duties included helping the housemaid with upstairs cleaning twice weekly. She'd been in that room, had seen the jewellery box, knew where it was kept, and... He paused, looked into his teacup as if the leaves might offer absolution. She had debts. "Ah," Holmes said softly. Her mother was ill back in Dorset. Annie had been sending money home for medical care, but it wasn't enough. She'd taken a small loan from one of those dreadful lending establishments that prey on servants. You know the type, Doctor. Charge unconscionable interest rates, threaten all manner of consequences for late payment. She owed nearly £10, a fortune for a girl earning £12 a year. The room had grown darker as they talked, the afternoon surrendering fully to evening now. Neither Holmes nor Watson moved to light the gas lamps yet. There was something appropriate about the dimness, the way the firelight created shadows that softened the edges of things, made the past feel closer, more present. "So she had motive," Watson said quietly. "Opportunity and motive, both." "And something more," Lestrade added, his voice dropping slightly. "When I questioned her, gently, mind you, I'm not a monster, she was evasive. Wouldn't meet my eyes. Her hands were shaking. She kept contradicting herself about where she'd been on the day the brooch went missing, what time she'd finished her duties, whether she'd been in Mrs. Ashworth's room that week or the week before. Classic signs of guilt, or so I thought. So I've been trained to think. Holmes rose suddenly, startling them both, and crossed to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking down at Baker Street, where the gas lamps were being lit now, glowing orbs of amber in the grey-blue dusk. The lamplighter moved along his route with the practised efficiency of repetition, his ladder over one shoulder, touching flame to wick, creating small havens of light in the advancing darkness. "You searched her belongings," Holmes said to the window, to the rain, to the darkening street. "I did, with Mr. Ashworth's permission, and with Annie's knowledge, though she could hardly have refused. We found—" Lestrade's voice carried a weight now, years of certainty beginning to show cracks. "We found the brooch, hidden in her mattress, wrapped in a handkerchief at the very centre, where you'd have to know exactly where to look to find it." Watson felt his heart sink. The evidence seemed damning. A girl with debts, with opportunity, caught in lies, the stolen item found in her possession. What else could a reasonable investigator conclude? And yet, Holmes stood at the window with that particular tension in his shoulders that meant something was bothering him. Something didn't fit. "She confessed, then?" Watson asked. "She did," Lestrade confirmed. "Broke down weeping, admitted she'd taken it, said she'd planned to pawn it and send the money home to her mother. Then panicked when the house was searched and couldn't figure out how to return it without being caught. It was—" He paused, searching for the word. "Textbook. A solved case. The brooch was recovered, returned to Mrs. Ashworth. Annie was dismissed without references, though Mr. Ashworth declined to press charges, said the family had been through enough scandal without a trial. Generous of him, really." "Generous," Holmes repeated, and the word carried a strange inflection, as if he were tasting it, and finding it bitter. The fire had burned low now, needing attention. Watson rose and added coal from the scuttle, using the brass tongs with the care of long practice. The new fuel caught slowly, reluctantly, sending up a brief smoke before settling into its work. The added light pushed back the shadows slightly, but the room remained dim, intimate, a space where confidences could be shared and old certainties questioned. Holmes turned from the window finally, returning to his chair. His face was thoughtful, the sharp features softened slightly by firelight and the growing dusk. "And what happened to Annie Fletcher?" he asked quietly. Lestrade's expression clouded. "I don't know. Vanished into London, I suppose. Without references, she'd have had difficulty finding respectable work. Perhaps she went back to Dorset. Perhaps—" He trailed off, leaving the perhaps to encompass all the dark possibilities that awaited young women alone in Victorian London, without money, without prospects, without anyone to vouch for their character. The three men sat in silence then, the weight of that unknown fate settling over them, like the evening itself, somewhere in London, or perhaps no longer in London at all, or perhaps no longer anywhere. Annie Fletcher had lived out the consequences of that day 7 years ago, when she'd confessed to a crime and been cast out from the only security she'd known in the city. Watson broke the silence, finally. "What makes you question it now, Lestrade? After all this time?" The inspector looked at his hands, at the empty teacup he still held. I've been working a case recently. Similar circumstances. Theft in a household. Suspicion falling on the newest servant. And as I was going through the motions, following the same steps I followed with Annie Fletcher, I had this moment. This sudden terrible thought. What if I'd gotten it wrong? What if the very things that seemed to prove guilt were actually something else entirely? He looked up at Holmes then, and his eyes held something raw, vulnerable. "You've made me better at my job, Mr. Holmes. Both of you have, in your different ways. You've taught me to question assumptions, to look past the obvious. And so, I've been lying awake at night, going over every detail of the Ashworth case, and I keep seeing," he gestured helplessly, "holes, things I didn't ask, alternatives I didn't consider. And I thought, if anyone could tell me whether I'm being foolish or whether there's something to this doubt, it would be you." Holmes leaned forward, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled once more beneath his chin. The firelight caught his eyes, making them gleam with that peculiar intensity that Watson had learned meant his friend's formidable mind was fully engaged. Outside, the rain continued its patient percussion, and somewhere in the building, Mrs. Hudson was preparing dinner, the scent of roasting meat beginning to drift up through the floorboards. "Tell me everything," Holmes said softly. "Every detail, every conversation, every observation from that day. Leave nothing out, no matter how trivial it seems. The truth, Lestrade, is always in the details we think don't matter." And so Lestrade began again, this time with the practiced thoroughness of a policeman giving testimony, reconstructing that day 7 years ago when he'd walked into a Bloomsbury townhouse and thought he'd solved a simple case of theft, never imagining that the solution might carry consequences that would follow him through the years. Patient as rain, waiting for the moment when he'd finally be ready to question what he'd been so certain he knew. The evening deepened around them, and Baker Street settled into its nighttime rhythms. But in the warm circle of firelight, 3 men bent themselves to the task of unpicking the past, searching for the thread that might unravel everything, or perhaps make sense of it at last. The story proper began with a morning in spring, 7 years distant now, but vivid still in Lestrade's memory, sharpened perhaps by the years of not quite forgetting that had preceded this telling. April, he thought it was, or perhaps early May. That treacherous season when London couldn't decide between winter's last gasp and summer's first promise, when one dressed for cold and found warmth, or prepared for sun and met rain. The Ashworth household had been in that particular state of controlled chaos that precedes significant social events, a beehive of activity where every worker knew their task and the consequences of failure. "I arrived mid-morning," Lestrade said, his voice settling into the rhythm of recollection, the slight distance that comes when one is no longer entirely in the present, but walking through rooms that exist now only in memory. The house was in Bloomsbury, as I mentioned, Russell Square specifically. One of those tall, narrow townhouses that look like they're holding their breath, trying to fit as much respectability as possible into the smallest footprint. 4 stories, if you count the servants' quarters in the attic, plus a basement for the kitchen and scullery. The sort of house that speaks of ambition more than a rival, if you understand me. Holmes nodded, eyes closed now, reconstructing. Watson could almost see it forming in his friend's mind. The precise architecture, the social implications of location and style, the whole intricate map of Victorian class geography that Holmes navigated as easily as some men read street signs. The door was answered by the butler, an older man named Graves. Been with the family since Mr. Ashworth's father's time, which gave him a certain authority in the household hierarchy. Dignified, competent, the sort who'd perfected the art of being simultaneously obsequious and condescending, depending on whether he was addressing the master or a mere Scotland Yard inspector. Lestrade smiled slightly at the memory. He showed me into the morning room, where Mrs. Ashworth was waiting. The morning room, as Lestrade described it, occupied the ground floor rear, overlooking a modest garden that probably received sunlight for approximately 40 minutes per day, if positioned exactly right with the neighbouring buildings. It was decorated in the style that characterized a certain stratum of Victorian middle-class aspiration. Decent furniture that wasn't quite fine, wallpaper in a fashionable pattern purchased at a fashionable price, everything maintained to a standard that suggested care and attention, but not unlimited funds for replacement or indulgence. Mrs. Ashworth was, distraught is perhaps too strong a word, distressed, certainly. She struck me as a woman who prided herself on maintaining composure, for whom displays of emotion were something other people did, something vaguely unseemly. But the missing brooch had shaken that composure. Her hands kept moving to her throat, where I suppose she was accustomed to feeling jewellery, finding nothing there, being reminded of the absence. Watson recognized the observation, the small physical tells that revealed emotional states despite practiced control. He'd learned to read such signs during his medical training, had refined the skill in army field hospitals where men claimed to be fine even as their bodies screamed otherwise. Mrs. Ashworth's wandering hands, seeking the familiar and finding void, painted a portrait more vivid than words alone could manage. She told me about the brooch first, its history, its significance. Her grandmother had commissioned it in the 1840s, early Victorian era, a time when craftsmanship still mattered more than mass production. The goldsmith had been someone of local renown, apparently, though the name escapes me now. The garnets had come from India, brought back by an uncle who'd served in the East India Company. Every element of the piece carried history, connection, the accumulated weight of family narrative. Holmes opened his eyes briefly. "Garnets, you said?" "Not rubies. Garnets, deep red, nearly black in certain lights. Less valuable than rubies, certainly, but the sentimental attachment made such comparisons irrelevant to the family." Mrs. Ashworth's voice actually trembled when she described how her mother had pinned it to her wedding dress, how she herself had worn it at her presentation at court, how it was meant to connect Margaret to all the women who'd come before. The fire crackled softly, and outside the rain had found a new rhythm, lighter now, a gentle, persistent whisper rather than the earlier drumming. It was the kind of rain that could continue for hours, days even, nothing dramatic about it. Just England being thoroughly, consistently, determinedly damp. Margaret was there as well, Lestrade continued. The daughter, 19 years old, as I mentioned, though she seemed younger. Or perhaps it was just that distress made her appear more childlike. She'd been crying, her eyes were red, her hands twisted a handkerchief into tortured shapes. The engagement dinner was 2 days away. The invitations had been sent, acceptances received, the menu planned, flowers ordered. And the centerpiece of the entire evening, the moment when Mrs. Ashworth would pin the family brooch on her daughter, passing it down with appropriate ceremony in front of witnesses who mattered, was impossible without the brooch itself. Watson could picture the girl, barely out of childhood really, caught in the machinery of social expectation. Marriage at 19 was common enough among the respectable classes, but common didn't mean easy, didn't mean the young women involved felt anything other than terrified at the prospect of having their entire futures decided in drawing rooms and over dinner tables, their worth measured in dowries and connections, and the ability to wear family heirlooms with appropriate grace. I asked the obvious questions first, Lestrade said. When had she last seen the brooch? 2 weeks prior, when she and her mother had discussed which dress she might wear for the announcement. Where was it kept? In the locked jewellery box, in the locked drawer, keys on Mrs. Ashworth's person at all times. Who had access to the dressing room? Here the list grew slightly longer. Mrs. Ashworth herself, naturally. Her lady's maid, a woman named Mrs. Penworth. Margaret was permitted to enter when chaperoned. The housemaid Ellen cleaned the room twice weekly, and the parlour-maid Annie assisted Ellen with the heavier tasks. Holmes stirred slightly, a minute shift that Watson recognized as interest-sharpening. The parlour-maid assisted with upstairs cleaning? Unusual, surely. Parlour-maids typically confine themselves to downstairs public rooms. I thought so too, at the time, Lestrade acknowledged. But Mrs. Ashworth explained they were slightly understaffed. One of the upstairs maids had left service to marry some months before, and they'd been managing with the existing staff, rather than hiring a replacement. Economy measure, I assumed, though she dressed it up as not having found the right candidate yet. In practice, it meant Annie Fletcher was pulled into tasks that wouldn't normally fall to a parlour-maid. The picture was filling in now, the household revealing its structure like a building emerging from fog. 5 servants, Lestrade had said earlier. Graves the butler, Mrs. Penworth the lady's maid, Ellen the housemaid, Annie the parlour-maid, and presumably a cook, though Lestrade hadn't mentioned her yet. A skeleton crew for a house that aspired to gentility, everyone working slightly beyond their designated roles, the gaps in staffing creating opportunities for both efficiency and error. I interviewed them all separately, Lestrade said. Started with Graves as senior servant. He was professional, precise, slightly offended that anyone in the household might be suspected of impropriety. He'd noticed nothing unusual, no strangers admitted to the house, no suspicious behaviour from any staff member. His testimony was unhelpful, honestly, too focused on defending the household's reputation to provide actual useful information. Watson smiled slightly. He'd met butlers like that, men whose identity was so completely bound up in the dignity of the houses they served that any suggestion of disorder was received as personal insult. They were guardians of respectability, and thieves represented chaos, the breakdown of proper order, everything they dedicated their lives to preventing. Mrs. Penworth was next, the lady's maid. She'd been with Mrs. Ashworth for 15 years, had come to the household as a young woman, and risen to the position of most trusted servant. She had more access to the jewellery than anyone except Mrs. Ashworth herself. Helped her dress, arranged her hair, would have handled the jewellery box regularly when selecting pieces for her mistress to wear. And you eliminated her as a suspect, Holmes said. Not quite a question. I did. Her tenure with the family, her references, her manner. Everything suggested absolute trustworthiness. And practically speaking, if she'd wanted to steal from Mrs. Ashworth, she'd had 15 years of opportunity, to do so far more subtly than snatching a brooch right before it was needed for a major family event. The timing alone argued against her involvement. Holmes made a small sound, neither agreement nor disagreement, just acknowledgement that he'd heard the reasoning. Watson knew that sound, knew it meant Holmes was filing the information away, reserving judgment, collecting pieces that would eventually form a pattern visible only to him. Ellen, the housemaid, was young, 16, perhaps 17. Country girl, been in service with the Ashworths for just over a year. She cleaned Mrs. Ashworth's dressing room every Tuesday and Friday, had done so dozens of times without incident. When I questioned her, she was frightened. Most servants are when police come asking questions, but not evasive. She accounted for her movements, described her cleaning routine in detail, mentioned that the jewellery box was always locked, that she'd never even seen inside it. The rain intensified again briefly, a gust of wind rattling the windows of 221B, and Watson glanced over to see water streaming down the glass in rivers, distorting the gaslight outside into abstract patterns of amber and shadow. The weather was determined to be noticed, to participate in their evening, to remind them that while they sat warm and dry, London beyond their walls was cold and wet and indifferent to comfort. That left Annie Fletcher, Lestrade said, and his voice changed slightly, took on a quality that Watson couldn't quite identify. Regret, perhaps, or the anticipatory wince of someone approaching an old wound. I spoke with her last, in the servants' hall, with Graves present as was proper. She was small, thin, with dark hair and dark eyes, and she looked absolutely terrified from the moment I asked her to sit down. Holmes had gone very still again, that complete immobility that meant every fibre of his being was focused on what came next. I asked her the standard questions. How long had she been in service with the Ashworths? 3 months. What were her duties? Cleaning the parlour, dining room, and hallway, serving at table, assisting with upstairs work as needed. Had she been in Mrs. Ashworth's dressing room? Yes, twice a week to help Ellen with the heavier cleaning. Had she ever seen the jewellery box? Yes, it was difficult to miss, sitting on the vanity. Had she ever touched it? No, never. It was always locked, and she had no business with her mistress's personal items. Lestrade paused, reaching for his teacup and finding it empty. Watson rose immediately, crossing to the tray where Mrs. Hudson had left the pot, still warm under its cosy, and refilled the inspector's cup, adding a measure of brandy without being asked. Lestrade accepted it with a grateful nod, cradling the warmth. Her answers were nervous, he continued. She stuttered, corrected herself, wouldn't maintain eye contact. When I asked where she'd been on the day the brooch went missing, which was the previous Thursday, 4 days before my interview, she fumbled the response, said she'd finished her morning duties, then changed it to afternoon, then couldn't remember if she'd helped with upstairs cleaning that day, or if it had been Ellen alone, said she'd had a headache, or perhaps that was a different day, or perhaps she was mixing up last week with the week before. Watson could picture it, the frightened girl, barely 18, facing a Scotland Yard inspector in a household where her employment, her survival, depended on maintaining the good opinion of people who could dismiss her without a second thought. Every question would have felt like a trap, every hesitation confirmation of guilt in her own mind, even if she was innocent. Fear and guilt could look remarkably similar from the outside. I asked about her family, Lestrade said quietly. It's something I always do. Helps establish rapport, puts people at ease sometimes. She told me about Dorset, about her father's death, about her mother, and 3 younger siblings still at home. She mentioned her mother was ill, needed medicine they could barely afford. And there it was, motive, clear as day. A girl with a sick mother, siblings to support, desperate for money, surrounded by wealth she could never legitimately access. The fire had burned down again, but this time no one moved to tend it. The room had grown warm enough from their presence, their breathing, the accumulated heat of bodies and conversation. The dimness felt appropriate now, necessary even, as if the story Lestrade was telling needed shadows to properly exist. I asked if she had any debts. She went white, actually lost colour from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Stammered out a denial at first, then admitted to a small loan, then, when I pressed, revealed it was nearly £10 from a lending establishment on Drury Lane. £10, gentlemen, on a salary of £12 per year. The interest alone would have been crippling. Holmes spoke then, his voice soft. You asked to search her belongings. I did. She couldn't refuse. Not really, though I phrased it as a request. Graves accompanied me to the attic, where the female servants slept. Annie's room was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a chest for her belongings, a hook for her spare dress, and nothing more. The room spoke of poverty, of a life stripped to absolute essentials. Lestrade's hands tightened around his teacup. I found the brooch in her mattress, not even well hidden, really, pushed into the centre, wrapped in a handkerchief, the kind of hiding place a child might choose. When I held it up, showed it to her, she collapsed, simply folded in on herself, and began sobbing. And then she confessed. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. A confession should have been the end, the resolution, the moment when uncertainty crystallized into certainty. But Watson could see from Holmes's expression that it was, for him, just the beginning of a different kind of questioning. What did she say, precisely? Holmes asked. Her confession. What were her exact words? Lestrade frowned, reaching back through the years. Something like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I just needed the money. My mother is dying. I didn't know what else to do. She was crying so hard it was difficult to make out all the words. She kept saying sorry, over and over, and that she'd planned to return it somehow. But then the house was searched, and she panicked and couldn't figure out how to put it back without being caught. Did she say when she took it? Watson asked. She said, Thursday, I think. The day it went missing. She said she'd seen the jewellery box sitting out. Mrs. Ashworth had been showing the brooch to Margaret earlier, and there was a moment when the room was empty and the box was unlocked, and she just took it. Impulse, desperation, opportunity, all colliding in a single moment. Holmes rose again, pacing now to the fireplace, back to the window. A restless energy that suggested his mind was working faster than his body could comfortably contain. And then, what happened? Mr. Ashworth was summoned. He questioned her himself, in my presence. Asked if she understood the seriousness of what she'd done, the betrayal of trust. She nodded, couldn't speak for crying. He said he wouldn't press charges, that the family had been through enough scandal with the brooch going missing, didn't need the additional publicity of a trial. But she was to leave immediately, that afternoon, without references. Graves would see to it that she collected her final wages, minus restitution for the distress caused. "Generous indeed," Holmes murmured, but the sarcasm was gentle, sad almost. "I thought so at the time," Lestrade admitted. She'd committed theft, confessed to it, but was being spared prosecution. Many employers would have been far harsher. Mr. Ashworth seemed genuinely pained by the whole affair, kept saying he'd trusted her, they'd all trusted her, and this was how she repaid that trust. The inspector set down his teacup finally, looking between Holmes and Watson with an expression that asked for understanding, or, perhaps, absolution. It seemed straightforward, a classic case. Desperate circumstances, opportunity, weak character, predictable outcome. I wrote my report, closed the file, never thought about Annie Fletcher again. Until recently, when I started wondering about all the things I didn't think to question at the time. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady, soft rhythm, the kind that could lull one to sleep if allowed. But none of the men in that room were drowsy now. The past had been excavated, laid out before them in all its seeming clarity, and Holmes stood at the window with his back to them, looking at nothing, seeing everything. The gears of his extraordinary mind beginning to turn over the details, searching for the flaw, the thread, the small, impossible thing that would unravel the entire carefully constructed narrative of certainty. "Tell me," Holmes said finally, turning to face them, firelight catching his profile. "Did you ever wonder why the jewellery box was unlocked?" And with the single question, the careful edifice of the solved case began, very gently, to crack. The question hung in the air, like smoke, drifting, dispersing, reforming into patterns that demanded attention. Lestrade's face registered the impact of it. Not shock, exactly, but the sudden stillness that comes when something you've carried for years shifts weight unexpectedly, revealing itself to be different than you'd thought, heavier or lighter, or simply shaped wrong for the burden you'd believed it to be. "Unlocked," he repeated, and the word came out slowly, tasting unfamiliar, despite being simple, common, a word he'd said and heard 1,000 times in his professional life. Mrs. Ashworth said she'd been showing the brooch to Margaret earlier that afternoon, looking at dresses, discussing how it might be worn. She must have left the box open when they finished. "Must have," Holmes echoed, and there was no mockery in it, just gentle emphasis on the assumption embedded in those two words. He moved away from the window finally, returning to his chair with the fluid economy of movement that characterized him, settling into position not for comfort, but for conversation, for the Socratic process he employed when guiding someone toward a conclusion they needed to reach themselves. But did she confirm this? Did she explicitly state that she'd left the box unlocked? Lestrade's brow furrowed, and Watson could see him reaching back through the years, trying to grasp the exact shape of conversations held in rooms he hadn't thought about in half a decade. Memory was a tricky thing. Watson knew from his own experience writing up cases. It smoothed rough edges, filled in gaps with probability, constructed narratives that felt true whether or not they aligned perfectly with what had actually occurred. "I assumed it," Lestrade admitted finally. "She said she'd shown Margaret the brooch earlier in the day. The box must have been unlocked for Annie to have taken it. I didn't think to ask specifically whether Mrs. Ashworth had locked it again afterward. It seemed—" He gestured helplessly. "Obvious. Unnecessary to confirm." "And yet," Holmes said softly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin in his characteristic pose of concentration. "Mrs. Ashworth struck you as a cautious woman. You said she was particular about security, kept the keys on her person day and night, locked the jewelry box inside a locked drawer. Does it seem consistent with such a character to leave valuable jewelry sitting out, accessible, in an unlocked box for hours?" The fire popped suddenly, a coal splitting with a sharp crack that made Watson flinch slightly. Outside, the rain continued its patient work, washing Baker Street clean of the day's accumulated grime, running in rivulets along gutters, pooling in the eternally uneven cobblestones where tomorrow's traffic would splash it onto the hems of skirts and the boots of men hurrying to appointments that seemed important until the rain reminded them otherwise. "No," Lestrade said quietly. "It doesn't. But then, if the box was locked, how did Annie get the brooch? She didn't have keys. She couldn't have picked the lock. It was a good quality lock, would have required skill and tools she certainly didn't possess." "Precisely," Holmes said, and his grey eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been sadness. Watson could never quite tell when Holmes was pleased to be proving a point, and when he was simply pained by the predictable blindness of human perception. Which suggests several possibilities, none of which were apparently explored at the time. Either Annie did have access to keys through some means you didn't discover, or the box was indeed unlocked, or she didn't take the brooch at all, Watson finished, the conclusion settling over him with the weight of the obvious in hindsight. Lestrade's face had gone through several transformations during this exchange: confusion, resistance, understanding, and now a kind of pale horror that spoke to the implications assembling themselves in his mind. "But she confessed," he said, and his voice carried the desperation of a man watching certainty crumble. "She confessed, and the brooch was in her possession, in her mattress, hidden exactly where someone guilty would hide it." "Yes," Holmes agreed, with that infinite patience he reserved for moments when he was genuinely trying to help, rather than simply demonstrate superiority. "She confessed. But to what, exactly? You said her words were, if I recall correctly, 'I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I just needed the money. My mother is dying. I didn't know what else to do.' None of which is actually a confession to theft, is it? She never said, 'I stole the brooch.' She said she was sorry. She needed money. She didn't know what else to do. Those statements could mean a great many things." Watson felt something cold settle in his stomach, the particular discomfort that came when he recognized human suffering that might have been prevented, should have been prevented, if only someone had asked the right questions. He'd felt it in field hospitals when men died of treatable infections because supplies arrived too late, felt it when reviewing medical cases where a different diagnosis might have saved a life. The past was immutable, but understanding where it had gone wrong never stopped being painful. "She was 18 years old," Holmes continued, his voice still gentle, "but relentless in the way of truth that won't be ignored. From the countryside, 3 months in a London household, terrified of a Scotland Yard inspector, desperate to send money home to a dying mother. She had debts she couldn't pay. And suddenly she's confronted with the brooch, the missing brooch everyone is frantic about, found in her mattress, in her possession, and you're asking her if she took it." He paused, letting the scene assemble in their minds. The attic room, barely larger than a closet, the frightened girl, the authority figure holding the evidence that condemned her, the butler standing witness, the entire weight of Victorian social hierarchy pressing down on this one moment, this one question. What would you say, Lestrade? What would any of us say, in such circumstances, if we were young and scared, and the evidence seemed damning, and we didn't understand how it had come to be there? Would we proclaim innocence and expect to be believed? Or would we simply collapse, apologize, try to explain the circumstances that made us seem guilty, even if we weren't? The room had gone very quiet. Even the fire seemed to have hushed itself, burning low and steady without its usual pops and cracks. The rain provided the only sound, that endless patient drumming that had witnessed a million human dramas and would witness a million more, indifferent to outcomes, caring only for its own persistent falling. Lestrade's hands had gone to his face, covering his eyes, pressing against the bridge of his nose, as if he could physically push back the realization assembling itself behind his forehead. "Dear God," he whispered, "what have I done?" "You did what you were trained to do," Watson said quickly, leaning forward with the instinct to comfort, to mitigate. "You followed the evidence, drew reasonable conclusions based on that evidence. Any investigator would have done the same." "Would they?" Holmes asked, and now there was something sharper in his tone. Not quite criticism, but not quite absolution either. "Would they, Watson? Or would a thorough investigator have asked more questions? Would they have wondered about the timing, the convenience, the sheer improbability of a girl committing theft in the least subtle way imaginable, and then hiding the evidence in the most obvious place available to her?" He rose again, pacing now with that restless energy that meant his mind was outrunning his body's ability to remain still. The room seemed to contract around his movement, the walls drawing closer, as if to contain the intensity of his thinking. "Consider the facts as you've presented them, Lestrade. Annie Fletcher had been in the household for 3 months without incident. She was described by everyone as quiet, hard-working, gave no cause for complaint. She needed money desperately, yes, but needing money and stealing it are not the same thing, no matter how often we conflate them in our assumptions about the poor." Watson found himself nodding despite himself. He'd seen it countless times in his medical practice, the automatic assumption that poverty equaled dishonesty, that the desperate would inevitably turn criminal. Sometimes they did, of course, but far more often they simply endured, bore their burdens with a dignity that shamed those who possessed every advantage, and yet complained about inconvenience. "The brooch goes missing on a Thursday," Holmes continued, ticking off points on his fingers as he paced. "This is 4 days before you interview Annie, which means 4 days between the alleged theft and your discovery of the brooch in her mattress. 4 days during which she has this valuable item hidden in the most obvious location imaginable, not pawned, not disposed of, not moved to a safer location, just sitting there waiting to be found." "She said she panicked," Lestrade offered weakly. "Said she'd planned to pawn it, but then the house was searched, and she didn't know how to return it." "Yes, the house was searched. When?" "That same evening, when Mrs. Ashworth discovered it missing. Thursday evening. And yet Annie, having just stolen this brooch, having hidden it in her mattress, allowed her room to be searched that very night. And somehow the brooch wasn't discovered then, despite being in such an obvious location that you found it easily 4 days later." The implication settled over them like a physical weight. Lestrade had gone very pale now. his earlier healthy colour from the warmth and brandy draining away, as understanding crystallized into something approaching certainty. Watson felt his own breath catch slightly, the pieces assembling themselves into a picture that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. Unless, Holmes said quietly, stopping his pacing to face them directly, the brooch wasn't in the mattress during that first search, unless it was placed there later, by someone who knew that suspicion would naturally fall on the newest, most vulnerable member of the household, someone who knew about Annie's debts, her desperate circumstances, her mother's illness, all of which would make her seem guilty, make her the perfect scapegoat for a theft she didn't commit. The fire crackled softly, exhaling warmth into the room, but Watson felt cold despite it. The rain against the windows sounded different now, less like ambient percussion and more like accusation. Each drop a small judgment against human blindness, human willingness to accept the convenient answer rather than pursuing the true one. "But who?" Lestrade asked, his voice rough with something that might have been anger or grief or both wound together. Who would do such a thing, and why? The brooch was recovered, returned to the family. What would anyone gain from such an elaborate deception? "That," Holmes said, settling back into his chair with the air of someone preparing for a long explanation, "is where we must examine not just what happened, but who stood to benefit from how it appeared to happen. We must look at the household itself, at the dynamics you observed, but perhaps didn't fully analyze. Who had access to Annie's room? Who knew about her debts? Who understood the workings of the house well enough to orchestrate such a frame?" Watson reached for his own teacup, found it empty, and set it aside. His mind was working now too, doctor's instincts combining with the investigative thinking he'd learned from years at Holmes's side. A household was like a body, he'd often thought, all parts connected, each affecting the others. And when something went wrong in one area, the symptoms often manifested elsewhere. "You said there were 5 servants," Watson began slowly. "Graves the butler, Mrs. Penworth the lady's maid, Ellen the housemaid, Annie the parlour maid, and you mentioned a cook, though you haven't described her yet." "Mrs. Cooper," Lestrade supplied automatically. "Middle-aged woman, been with the family about 5 years. I questioned her briefly, but she had no access to the upstairs, no opportunity for the theft. She seemed genuinely distressed by the whole affair." 5 servants for a household of that size, Holmes mused. "You mentioned they were understaffed, that one of the upstairs maids had left to marry. When did this departure occur?" "Some months before. I don't recall exactly. 3 or 4 months, perhaps." "So around the same time Annie was hired. Interesting timing. And who hired Annie? Was it Mr. Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth, or perhaps Graves as senior servant?" Lestrade frowned, thinking. "I believe. Graves mentioned he'd selected her from candidates at the registry office. Mrs. Ashworth approved the choice, but Graves made the actual selection. Standard practice for that level of staff." "And yet," Holmes said thoughtfully, "despite being selected by Graves himself, despite giving no cause for complaint during her 3 months of service, he was quite willing to believe in her guilt when questioned. You said he was offended by the suggestion anyone in the household might be a thief, but presumably that offence didn't extend to defending Annie's character." The observation was pointed, and Lestrade had no answer for it. Watson watched his friend at work, recognized the pattern. Holmes was circling something, approaching it from multiple angles, building a framework of questions, that would eventually collapse into a single, inevitable answer. It was like watching an architect work in reverse, deconstructing a building to reveal the faulty foundation everyone had been walking on without realizing it was unsound. "Let's consider Mrs. Penworth," Holmes suggested, shifting his attention. 15 years of loyal service, complete trust, access to all the jewelry. You eliminated her because her tenure argued against sudden theft. But what if it wasn't sudden? What if someone with her access and knowledge had been, shall we say, supplementing her income for some time in ways that wouldn't be immediately noticed? Watson's eyes widened. "You think she'd been stealing all along?" "I think we should consider the possibility. Small thefts, careful ones, items that wouldn't be missed immediately or might be assumed lost or misplaced. A woman in her position would know exactly which pieces were worn regularly, which sat forgotten in boxes, which might vanish for months or years without anyone noticing. It's possible Mrs. Ashworth had lost jewelry before, and simply assumed she'd misplaced it, that it would turn up eventually." "But the brooch was different," Lestrade said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "The brooch was needed, specific date, specific purpose. If Mrs. Penworth had taken it thinking it was just another piece she could steal safely, and then realized it was required for the engagement dinner, she would have needed to return it," Holmes finished. "But how to do so without raising questions about where it had been? Much safer to have it discovered in someone else's possession, with that someone being an ideal suspect, young, desperate, already vulnerable to suspicion." The rain had intensified again, drumming harder against the windows, as if the weather itself was invested in this reconstruction of events 7 years past. London beyond Baker Street had fully surrendered to evening now, the darkness complete except for the gaslight, creating small islands of illumination in the general gloom. Mrs. Hudson could be heard moving about downstairs, the sounds of dinner preparation drifting up through the floorboards, the clatter of pots, the running of water, the familiar domestic symphony that continued regardless of the intellectual dramas unfolding in the rooms above. "But we're speculating," Watson pointed out, ever the voice of caution. "We have no evidence Mrs. Penworth was involved, no proof of previous thefts. It's just a theory." "Quite right, Watson," Holmes agreed easily. "We're theorizing, constructing possibilities from the gaps in Lestrade's investigation. But sometimes theory points us toward questions that should have been asked. Tell me, Lestrade, did you investigate Mrs. Penworth's financial situation? A lady's maid's wages are modest. Did she have family to support, debts of her own, any indication of where her money went?" Lestrade shook his head slowly. "No, she was trusted, established, respectable. I never thought to question her finances. And Annie's room, who had access to it? Who could have entered, placed the brooch in her mattress without being seen?" "Any of the servants, potentially. The attic rooms weren't locked during the day. Servants moved between floors regularly for their duties. Mrs. Penworth certainly had reason to be upstairs, collecting laundry, delivering messages, supervising the housemaids." The framework was assembling itself now, the alternative narrative taking shape from shadow and speculation, but feeling more solid, more real with each detail that slotted into place. Watson could see it in Lestrade's face, the growing conviction that what they were constructing wasn't just theory, but truth, or something very close to it. The answer that had been hiding in plain sight for 7 years, waiting for someone to ask the questions that mattered. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the intensity easing slightly from his posture, though his eyes remained sharp, watchful. "I'm not saying this is definitely what happened, Lestrade, but I am saying it's possible, probable even, and you owe it to yourself and to Annie Fletcher, wherever she is now, to consider it seriously. A scared girl confessing under pressure is not the same as a guilty person admitting their crime, and evidence planted is not the same as evidence earned through actual guilt." The inspector sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped before him, staring into the fire as if the flames might offer absolution or at least clarity. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, barely contained. "If you're right," he said quietly, "if even half of what you're suggesting is true, then I destroyed that girl's life for nothing, sent her out into London without references, without prospects, based on assumptions and convenient explanations and my own blindness to alternatives." "You did what you thought was right," Watson offered again, but even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "No," Lestrade said firmly, looking up to meet their eyes. "I did what was easy. There's a difference, and I should have known better." The rain, the fire, the gathering darkness, all of it seemed to lean in around them, witnessing this confession, this reckoning with past certainty revealed as error. And somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime the hour, marking time's passage with the indifference of mechanism, each strike a reminder that 7 years had passed and could not be reclaimed, only perhaps finally understood. The clock's chimes faded into the rain's rhythm, and for a moment the three men sat in the settling silence, each occupied with their own thoughts, their own reconstructions of what might have been versus what was. Holmes reached for his pipe again, finding it had gone cold, and set about the ritual of relighting it. The careful tamping of tobacco, the scratch of the match, the first careful draws that coaxed ember into life. The small domestic actions seemed to ground them, pull them back from the precipice of speculation into something more methodical, more deliberate. "Let us reconstruct it properly, then," Holmes said finally, smoke curling upward from his pipe in lazy spirals. "Not what you thought happened, Lestrade, but what actually might have occurred. We'll build it piece by piece, test each element against the facts as you know them, and see what structure emerges." Lestrade nodded, straightening in his chair with the air of a man preparing himself for something difficult, but necessary. Watson recognized the expression. He'd seen it on soldiers' faces before surgery. That steeling of resolve, that decision to face pain because the alternative was worse. "Start with Mrs. Penworth," Holmes suggested. 15 years of service, complete access to Mrs. Ashworth's jewellery. You said the lady's maid helped her mistress dress, arranged her hair, would have handled the jewellery box regularly. In such a position, small thefts might go unnoticed for years. A brooch taken when Mrs. Ashworth was between social seasons, assuming she'd misplaced it. Earrings borrowed and not returned, their absence attributed to faulty memory. The occasional ring that vanished from a drawer, mourned briefly, and then forgotten. "But why would she risk it?" Watson asked. "After 15 years of steady employment, why jeopardize everything for relatively modest thefts?" "Ah, Watson, that's where we must consider the economics of service," Holmes replied, warming to his subject in the way he did when explaining the mechanics of crime, the practical mathematics of desperation and opportunity. "A lady's maid, Even a senior one might earn £25 to £30 per year. Respectable wages, certainly, but hardly generous. And service offers no security beyond continued employment, no pension, no provision for old age or illness. A woman in such a position, particularly one without family support, might well engage in quiet supplementation of her income, building a small reserve against an uncertain future. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals now, radiating heat without the drama of flame. Watson rose to add more fuel, selecting pieces carefully from the scuttle, building the fire back up with the methodical attention that physical tasks demanded. The new coal caught slowly, reluctantly, sending up wisps of smoke before committing to combustion. By the time he returned to his seat, Holmes had continued his reconstruction. So, we have Mrs. Penworth engaging in careful, selective theft over a period of months, or perhaps years. She knows Mrs. Ashworth's habits intimately, knows which pieces are favoured, which are neglected, which might vanish without immediate notice. And then, one day, she takes the garnet brooch. Why? Lestrade interrupted. You just said she was careful, selective. The brooch was important to the family, had sentimental value. Why take that particular piece? Perhaps she didn't realize its significance, Holmes mused. Or perhaps, and this seems more likely, she took it during a period when she believed it safe to do so. You said Mrs. Ashworth had shown the brooch to Margaret 2 weeks before the engagement dinner. What if Mrs. Penworth, observing this, assumed the brooch had been selected, and would be worn soon, which meant its absence would be noticed within days? What if she had already taken it weeks or months earlier, and only now realized it would be missed? Watson leaned forward, following the logic. So she'd stolen it previously, perhaps not even recently, assuming it was just another piece that wouldn't be worn for some time. And then, suddenly, Mrs. Ashworth wants it for the engagement announcement, and Mrs. Penworth realizes the theft is about to be discovered. Precisely. Now she faces a dilemma. She can't simply return the brooch. That would raise questions about where it had been. If she claims to have found it, where? And why didn't it turn up during the initial search? No, returning it directly is too risky. But if it were to be discovered in someone else's possession, with that person appearing obviously guilty— Annie Fletcher, Lestrade said quietly, his voice heavy with understanding. Young, desperate, with debts everyone knew about, because servants gossip, because household business never stays private below stairs. The perfect suspect. Holmes nodded. Consider what Mrs. Penworth would have known. Annie had been open about her mother's illness, had probably mentioned the money she was trying to send home. The debt to the lending establishment was likely no secret among the staff. Such things rarely are. Mrs. Penworth would have known that Annie was vulnerable, that suspicion would naturally gravitate toward the newest, most financially desperate member of the household. The rain against the windows had settled into a steady whisper now, softer than before, as if even the weather was leaning in to listen. Somewhere in the house a door closed, Mrs. Hudson completing her movements between kitchen and pantry, the sounds so familiar after years in these rooms that they barely registered as sound at all, just part of Baker Street's breathing. So she plants the brooch in Annie's mattress, Watson said, working through it. Sometime between Thursday evening, when it was first discovered missing, and Monday when Lestrade found it there. But how? Surely Annie would have noticed someone disturbing her bed, her mattress? Would she? Holmes countered gently. Think about the hierarchy of a Victorian household, Watson. A parlour-maid is among the lowest ranks of female servants. A lady's maid occupies a position of considerable status, second only to the housekeeper in many establishments. If Mrs. Penworth appeared in Annie's attic room, ostensibly to inspect housekeeping standards or deliver a message, or any of a dozen plausible reasons, would Annie question it? Would she dare? Lestrade's expression had gone distant, remembering. No, he said slowly. She wouldn't dare. And Mrs. Penworth would have known that, would have counted on it. The power dynamics alone would have prevented Annie from questioning why a senior servant was in her space. Exactly. And the timing would have been simple enough to arrange. Annie would have been downstairs performing her duties. The attic would have been empty. Mrs. Penworth could have slipped up, hidden the brooch, and been gone in moments. The mattress at the centre is classic misdirection. Seems like careful hiding, but is actually quite obvious once you're looking for something. Too obvious for someone genuinely trying to conceal stolen goods, but perfect for someone wanting the items to be found. Watson felt a cold anger building in his chest, the particular fury that came from witnessing injustice, from seeing how easily the powerless could be sacrificed to protect the comfortable. And then she simply waited for the inevitable investigation, knowing that a Scotland Yard inspector would follow the evidence exactly where she'd led it. No offence intended, Lestrade, Holmes added quickly, catching the wounded expression on the inspector's face. None taken, Lestrade replied, though his voice suggested otherwise. You're right. I followed exactly where I was led, saw what I expected to see, asked the questions that confirmed what I already suspected. Classic confirmation bias, the very thing I pride myself on avoiding, and I walked straight into it. The fire crackled sharply, a coal splitting with a small explosive pop that sent sparks up the chimney. The sound broke the momentary tension, reminded them that they were in Baker Street, safe and warm, reconstructing events long past, not standing in that Bloomsbury attic watching a girl's life unravel based on manufactured evidence. The confession troubles me most, Holmes said, and there was genuine sadness in his voice now, the sharp edges of his intellect softened by something approaching grief. Because it wasn't really a confession at all, was it? You presented Annie with the brooch found in her possession and asked her if she took it. A young girl, terrified, confronted with what appears to be damning evidence, surrounded by authority figures whose good opinion determines her entire future. What would any of us say in such circumstances? She said she was sorry, Lestrade recalled, and Watson could hear him reliving the moment, seeing it now through different eyes. She said she needed the money. Her mother was dying. She didn't know what else to do. I took that as confession, as admission of theft. But she never actually said she stole the brooch, Watson finished. She said she was sorry, which could mean sorry for the situation, sorry for being found with it, sorry for not knowing how to prove her innocence. She said she needed money, which was simply true and not an admission of theft. She said she didn't know what else to do, which, in context, could mean she didn't know how to explain the brooch's presence in her room, didn't know how to defend herself against what looked like overwhelming evidence. Holmes nodded slowly. And when you asked her directly about taking it, she likely said yes. But was she confirming that she'd stolen it, or simply agreeing that yes, she'd been found with it? Yes, it appeared to be in her possession. A scared 18-year-old girl doesn't parse language with legal precision, Lestrade. She responds to the emotional weight of the moment, to the crushing certainty that she's already been judged and found guilty. The room had grown darker as they talked, the fire providing the primary illumination now, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar furniture strange and dimensional. Watson glanced at the clock. Nearly 7. They'd been at this for hours, unpicking an old case thread by thread, and somewhere in London the city was preparing for evening, lighting lamps, closing shops, settling into the routines that marked day's end and night's beginning. "There's another element," Holmes said, rising to pace again, his restless energy returning as new thoughts assembled themselves. "The search of Annie's room on Thursday evening, when the brooch was first discovered missing. You said the entire house was searched, every room, every drawer. And yet, the brooch wasn't found in Annie's mattress during that search." "She said she'd hidden it well," Lestrade offered, but even he sounded unconvinced by his own words now. "Hidden it well enough that a household search conducted in a state of high alert didn't discover it, but not well enough that you found it easily 4 days later? That strains credulity, Lestrade. The much simpler explanation is that the brooch wasn't there during the Thursday evening search because it hadn't been placed there yet. Mrs. Penworth was still carrying it, or had it hidden in her own room, somewhere she knew was safe from the kind of casual search Mr. Ashworth would conduct. And then she waited, Watson said, following the logic. Waited to see if the initial panic would die down, if perhaps Mrs. Ashworth would assume the brooch was simply lost and let the matter drop. But when that didn't happen, when Scotland Yard was called in, she needed to act quickly, Holmes completed. Needed to plant the evidence before a more thorough investigation began, before suspicion might turn in unexpected directions. So sometime between Thursday evening and Monday morning, she slipped upstairs, concealed the brooch in Annie's mattress, and let nature, or rather, predictable human bias, take its course. Lestrade had gone very still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. The whole household knew Scotland Yard had been called. I sent word on Sunday that I'd be coming Monday morning to conduct interviews and a thorough search. Mrs. Penworth would have known she was running out of time. "Sunday night, then," Holmes suggested, "or very early Monday morning. The other servants asleep, the household quiet, a few moments to slip into the attic, make the placement, and retreat. Simple, quick, devastating." The fire had built back to a healthy blaze now, the new coal fully engaged, throwing heat that made the room almost too warm. But none of them moved to adjust it, to open a window, to seek relief from the temperature. There was something appropriate about the heat, the slight discomfort, the physical reminder that they were dealing with matters that should make one uncomfortable, that demanded attention despite the urge to turn away. "I destroyed her life," Lestrade said finally, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Based on planted evidence and a coerced confession and my own damned certainty that I knew guilt when I saw it. Annie Fletcher was innocent, and I sent her out into London with nothing, no references, no prospects, no defence against what this city does to young women in such circumstances." Watson wanted to offer comfort, wanted to say something that would ease the stark horror in Lestrade's voice. But what was there to say? Holmes had been right in his reconstruction. Watson felt it, with the certainty that sometimes came when disparate facts aligned into unavoidable truth. And if they were right, then yes, Lestrade had destroyed an innocent girl's life, had been the instrument of an injustice that had echoed through 7 years, and would echo further still. You couldn't have known, Watson tried anyway, because silence felt worse than inadequate comfort. I should have known, Lestrade countered, looking up with eyes that held both anger and anguish. That's the point, isn't it? That's what Mr. Holmes has been showing me, step by patient step. I should have questioned the convenient timing, the obvious suspect, the too neat resolution. I should have wondered why a girl careful enough to avoid detection for 3 months would suddenly commit theft in the most blatant, foolish way possible. I should have asked about the locked jewellery box, about the Thursday night search, about a dozen details that didn't quite fit, but that I smoothed over because they complicated a narrative I wanted to be simple. Holmes had stopped his pacing, standing now by the bookshelf where the skull grinned its permanent grin, casting strange shadows in the firelight. "You're being too hard on yourself, Lestrade," he said quietly, and there was genuine kindness in his voice, the compassion he showed so rarely but so completely when he did. The evidence was compelling. The confession seemed genuine. Any investigator would have drawn the same conclusions given the same circumstances. The fault lies not with your reasoning, but with the person who manipulated the circumstances to produce exactly that reasonable conclusion. "Mrs. Penworth," Lestrade said, and the name came out flat, hard, weighted with 7 years of consequences. "If your reconstruction is correct, if she really did frame Annie Fletcher to cover her own theft, then she's the one who destroyed that girl's life. She's the one who looked at a desperate 18-year-old and decided she was expendable, useful as a scapegoat, and nothing more." "Yes," Holmes agreed simply, though proving it now, after all this time, would be nearly impossible. The case is closed, the principles scattered, the evidence long since disposed of. We can reconstruct what likely happened, but reconstruction isn't proof, isn't the kind of certainty that would reopen an investigation or restore Annie Fletcher's reputation. The rain had intensified again, as if it had been waiting for this moment to reassert itself, drumming against the windows with renewed vigour. London beyond Baker Street was drowning in it, streets running with water, the Thames rising against its embankments, the whole vast city engaged in its eternal struggle with English weather, a battle neither side would ever definitively win. "But we can look," Lestrade said, and there was determination in his voice now, the despair beginning to crystallize into purpose. "We can try to find out what happened to Annie Fletcher, whether she survived, where she ended up. And we can look into Mrs. Penworth's history, her financial situation, see if there's any pattern that might support your theory. It's not justice, maybe, but it's something. It's more than I've done for the past 7 years." Watson felt a surge of respect for the inspector. This was what separated good men from merely competent ones, the willingness to confront their own errors, to pursue truth even when it was painful, to try to make amends even when the debt seemed unpayable. Lestrade had his flaws, his limitations, but his fundamental decency was showing through now, illuminated by the harsh light of understanding. "I'll help," Watson offered immediately. "Whatever you need, research, inquiries, another perspective. This matters, Lestrade. Getting it right now, even if it's late, still matters." "As will I," Holmes added, returning to his chair with a fluid grace that suggested decision made, course committed to. Though I should warn you, the trail is cold and may lead nowhere. 7 years is a long time, particularly for someone without resources. But we can try. We can at least try to find out what became of Annie Fletcher, and perhaps in doing so find some measure of—" He paused, searching for the right word. If not redemption, then at least understanding. The fire settled into its rhythm. The rain found its steady pulse. And in the warm circle of light in Baker Street, 3 men sat together and contemplated the weight of past actions, the cost of assumptions, the price paid by those who had no voice in their own defense. And though no words could undo what had been done, though 7 years couldn't be reclaimed or rewritten, there was something in their shared determination that felt like the beginning of something. A small light against the darkness of injustice, fragile, but refusing to go out. Outside, London endured the rain. Inside, companionship strengthened into purpose, and the evening stretched ahead with the promise of stories still to tell, truths still to uncover. And perhaps, if they were very fortunate and very determined, a measure of peace for a girl whose name they now carried like a responsibility they couldn't set down. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with the timing that suggested she'd been listening to the rhythm of their conversation, waiting for the natural pause that would make her entrance welcome, rather than intrusive. She carried a tray laden with covered dishes, the scent of roasted chicken and root vegetables preceding her into the room, cutting through the accumulated layers of tobacco smoke and coal fire with the authority of good, simple food prepared by someone who understood the restorative properties of a proper meal. "I thought you gentlemen might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the side table with practiced efficiency. "You've been talking for hours, and Inspector Lestrade looks like he could use something substantial." Her tone carried that particular quality of landladies everywhere, who managed to be both deferential and commanding simultaneously, suggesting rather than ordering, but making clear that refusal would be both noticed and disapproved of. "Mrs. Hudson, you're a marvel," Watson said warmly, rising to help her arrange the dishes. The steam rising from the plates carried warmth and comfort, and he realized suddenly how hungry he was, how the afternoon had stretched into evening without any of them noticing the passage of time enough to consider mundane necessities like food. "I'm a woman who knows when men need feeding," she corrected, but smiled as she said it. "There's plenty for 3, and I've brought up another pot of tea. Inspector, you're looking rather peaked. Make sure you eat properly." Lestrade managed a wan smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. You're very kind." She paused on her way out, looking back at them with an expression that was difficult to read in the firelight, but seemed to carry understanding, perhaps even sympathy. "Whatever you're working through up here, it's important work. I can tell that much. Don't let it consume you entirely, though. Some problems are better considered on a full stomach." And with that gentle wisdom delivered, she departed, her footsteps soft on the stairs, leaving them with the food and their thoughts. They ate in a companionable, near silence, the kind that falls over people who've shared something significant and need time to process it internally before more words can be assembled. The food was excellent, as Mrs. Hudson's cooking always was, the chicken tender, the vegetables roasted to the perfect degree between soft and structured, the gravy rich without being heavy. Watson found himself eating with more attention than usual, aware of flavors and textures in the way that sometimes happened when emotion heightened other senses, made the world more immediate, more present. Holmes ate sparingly, as he often did when his mind was occupied, treating food as fuel rather than pleasure. But even he seemed to recognize the necessity of it, the need to tend to physical requirements before pursuing intellectual ones. Lestrade ate steadily, mechanically, barely seeming to notice what he was consuming, but clearing his plate nonetheless, his body demanding sustenance, even as his mind wrestled with implications and regrets. When the plates were cleared and fresh tea poured, Holmes lit another pipe. His third of the evening, Watson noted, which meant his friend's mind was working at full capacity, churning through possibilities and reconstructions. The smoke rose in familiar patterns, and Watson found himself oddly comforted by the sight, by this reminder that some things remained constant even as others were revealed to be far more complex than they'd appeared. "I've been thinking," Lestrade said finally, cradling his teacup in both hands, "about the other cases. The ones I worked before I met you, Mr. Holmes, before you taught me to question assumptions. How many other Annie Fletchers might there be? How many times did I see what I expected to see, follow evidence that seemed obvious, close cases that felt straightforward but might have been wrong?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Watson saw Holmes's expression shift, softening into something approaching tenderness. The look he got when confronted with genuine human vulnerability, the moments when his formidable intellect gave way to equally formidable compassion. "You can't think that way, Lestrade," Holmes said gently. "That path leads to paralysis, to second-guessing every decision, until you can't make any decisions at all. You did your best with the knowledge and training you had. That's all any of us can do." "Is it enough, though?" Lestrade looked between them, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and something else, a kind of weary searching. Is doing our best sufficient when our best might ruin innocent lives? Watson leaned forward, drawing on his medical experience, on the ethics he'd grappled with throughout his career. "No course of action is without risk of error," he said carefully. "I've made mistakes in diagnosis, in treatment, decisions that seemed right at the time, but that I later learned were wrong. The question isn't whether we make mistakes. We will, inevitably, but what we do when we discover them, whether we learn, whether we improve, whether we try to make amends where possible." "The doctor's right," Holmes added, and Watson felt a small warm glow at the praise, rare and therefore precious. "You can't undo the Ashworth case, Lestrade, but you can learn from it, can apply those lessons going forward. And perhaps, if we're very fortunate, we can find Annie Fletcher and offer her something, not justice, perhaps, but acknowledgement, recognition that she was wronged, that her suffering mattered." The rain had softened to a gentle patter now, a soothing backdrop rather than an insistent presence. The room had taken on that quality of deep evening comfort when the day's obligations have been met and the night stretches ahead with the promise of rest, when conversation can meander without urgency, exploring territories that daylight makes difficult to access. "Tell me," Watson said, shifting the subject slightly, "about the Ashworth family itself. You've described the servants in detail, but what of the principals? Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, Margaret, the other children. What were they like?" Lestrade considered, gathering his memories. Mr. Ashworth was impressive, I suppose. Tall, well-dressed, spoke with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. He worked in banking, as I mentioned, something to do with investments in colonial enterprises, India, I believe, and perhaps South Africa. He had that particular air of men who deal in large sums of other people's money, confident, slightly removed, as if the concerns of individual households were beneath his usual sphere of attention. But he cared about the brooch, Watson observed, enough to pull strings at Scotland Yard for immediate investigation. He cared about scandal, Lestrade corrected, about the family's reputation, the social embarrassment of having to cancel or postpone the engagement announcement. I'm not sure he cared much about the brooch itself, or even particularly about his daughter's feelings. It was the appearance that mattered, maintaining the facade of respectability, of a household properly run. Holmes made a small sound of interest. And Mrs. Ashworth? You said she was distressed about the loss. She was. More genuinely than her husband, I think. The brooch meant something to her beyond mere value. It connected her to her mother, her grandmother, to a lineage of women. There was real emotion in how she spoke about it, real pain at its loss. Though, Lestrade paused, frowning slightly. There was also something performative about it, as if she was playing the role of distraught mother and wronged mistress, because that was what was expected, what was proper. Victorian womanhood in miniature, Watson murmured. Expected to have feelings, but only the appropriate ones, expressed in the appropriate manner at the appropriate time. Exactly so. Margaret, the daughter, she seemed genuinely distressed, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the whole situation, by the impending marriage, by the weight of family expectations. She was very young, barely out of girlhood, and there was something unformed about her, as if she hadn't quite decided who she was yet, but was being pressed into a mould regardless. Watson felt a pang of sympathy for the girl. 19 was young for such decisions, though it was common enough among the respectable classes. Still, being married off to secure family connections, wearing heirloom jewellery to announce one's betrothal like a badge of successful negotiation rather than affection, it all seemed rather cold when examined too closely. Did you ever wonder, Holmes asked carefully, whether the theft might have been about more than simple monetary need? Whether someone in that household might have had reasons beyond finances for wanting to disrupt the engagement announcement? Lestrade's eyebrows rose. You think Margaret might have been involved? That she staged the theft to avoid or delay her marriage? I'm asking whether you considered it, Holmes replied. A young woman, pressured into an engagement she perhaps didn't want, facing a public announcement that would make backing out socially devastating. The missing brooch would provide a perfect excuse for postponement, for reconsidering, for buying time. Lestrade hesitated, thinking back. No, I didn't consider it. She seemed too distressed, too genuinely upset by the situation. And she had no need to steal the brooch. If she wanted to postpone the announcement, she could have simply claimed illness, headaches, any of the acceptable excuses young women employ for such things. Unless she wanted something more permanent, Watson suggested, caught up in the speculation. Not just postponement, but cancellation. If the brooch couldn't be found, if there was scandal in the household, perhaps the fiancé's family would consider the connection less desirable. Some families are particular about such things, about associations with households touched by theft. Holmes nodded approvingly at Watson's reasoning. It's possible, though if Margaret did take it, she miscalculated rather badly. The brooch was found, the announcement proceeded, and an innocent girl paid the price for her attempted escape from unwanted matrimony. "We're speculating again," Lestrade said, but there was less resistance in his voice now, more willingness to consider alternatives. Building theories without evidence. Speculation that opens new questions is valuable, Holmes countered. Even if this particular theory is wrong, it reminds us that households are complex ecosystems, that multiple people might have multiple motives for the same action. Did the engagement proceed as planned? I believe so. I didn't follow up afterward. Once the case was closed, my involvement ended. But I seem to recall seeing a society page announcement some weeks later. Miss Margaret Ashworth married to a Mr. Charles something. The name escapes me. And was she happy, do you suppose? Watson asked quietly. Lestrade spread his hands helplessly. How would I know? How does anyone know whether society marriages produce happiness or merely the appearance of it? She did what was expected of her, married the appropriate person at the appropriate age, and presumably went on to produce the appropriate number of children to continue the appropriate family lines. There was something unutterably sad about that description, Watson thought. A whole life reduced to meeting expectations, fulfilling obligations, maintaining appearances. And yet, it was the story of thousands of young women across England, across the empire, their individual desires and dreams, subordinated to family ambition and social positioning. The fire was burning low again, the coals settling into glowing beds of heat that radiated warmth without drama. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, just occasional drops against the glass now. The storm spent, leaving London washed clean and quiet in its wake. The city would be beautiful tomorrow, Watson thought. That particular crisp clarity that follows heavy rain, when even the soot-stained buildings seem renewed, ready to begin again. I find myself thinking about Mrs. Penworth, Holmes said, breaking the contemplative silence. If our reconstruction is correct, she's the architect of this entire tragedy. She committed the original theft, framed an innocent girl, and has presumably continued her life with no consequences, no accountability. That troubles me. It troubles me too, Lestrade agreed. But, as you said, proving anything now would be nearly impossible, and even if we could prove it, what then? She'd be what, 60 years old now? Possibly retired from service, possibly dead. Prosecuting an old woman for a crime committed 7 years ago, for which the case is officially closed, and the victim unlikely to testify, even if we could find her. "Justice delayed is justice denied," Watson quoted softly. "Yes, but sometimes justice is simply impossible," Lestrade replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "We don't live in a world where every wrong can be righted, every mistake corrected. Sometimes all we can do is acknowledge what happened, learn from it, and try to prevent similar wrongs going forward." Holmes rose and crossed to the window, looking down at Baker Street, where the wet cobblestones gleamed under gaslight, reflecting the world back at itself in wavering duplicates. I suppose that's the nature of detective work, isn't it? We solve puzzles, uncover truths, but we can't always undo the consequences of those truths. We can't restore what's been taken, repair what's been broken. We can only shine light into dark places and hope that illumination itself has value. "It does," Watson said firmly. "Understanding has value. Truth has value." even if Annie Fletcher never knows that we've reconstructed her story, even if Mrs. Penworth never faces consequences, the fact that we understand what really happened, that we've acknowledged the injustice, that matters. That has to matter. Lestrade looked at them both, and something in his expression eased slightly, some of the raw pain giving way to something that wasn't quite peace, but perhaps approached acceptance. "Thank you," he said quietly, "both of you, for taking this seriously, for helping me see what I should have seen 7 years ago, for not dismissing it as ancient history, better left alone." "How could we dismiss it?" Holmes asked, turning from the window. "You came here troubled by doubt, seeking understanding. That's what we do, Lestrade. You and Watson and I. We pursue understanding even when it's uncomfortable, even when it reveals our own fallibility. That's not weakness. That's the only way to become better than we were." The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 8, the sound soft in the rain-washed quiet. Mrs. Hudson could be heard downstairs, tidying the kitchen, preparing the house for night. The familiar sounds of Baker Street settling into evening routine, the daily rituals that marked time's passage and provided structure to lives that might otherwise feel unmoored by the weight of questions that had no easy answers. "I should go," Lestrade said, though he made no move to rise. "It's late, and you've given me much to think about. More than I expected when I walked through your door this afternoon, soaking wet and seeking refuge from the rain." "Stay a bit longer," Watson urged. "Have another cup of tea. There's no rush, and the rain's only just stopped. Give the streets time to drain a bit before you venture out." And so Lestrade stayed, settling back into his chair with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion and relief in equal measure. Holmes returned to his own seat, and Watson poured fresh tea all around, adding generous measures of brandy because the evening seemed to call for it, because warmth and companionship were antidotes to the chill of examining past failures and present uncertainties. They talked of other things then, old cases, mutual acquaintances, the peculiarities of London life. The conversation meandered like a river finding its course, touching on this topic and that, never staying anywhere too long, just the comfortable exchange of men who'd earned each other's respect and affection through shared experiences, shared challenges, shared determination to make sense of a world that often resisted sense-making. And gradually, imperceptibly, the weight of the Ashworth case began to lift slightly, not disappearing, but becoming bearable, integrated into the larger tapestry of their lives and work. The fire burned steady. The rain's last drops fell soft against the windows, and Baker Street held them in its familiar embrace, offering the only comfort it could, the reminder that even difficult truths were easier to bear when shared, that companionship itself was a form of courage, and that the day's end, when it came, could bring peace even to the most troubled conscience. The brandy had worked its gentle magic, smoothing the sharp edges of the evening's revelations, creating a warmth that had less to do with temperature than with the quality of understanding that had been reached. The three men sat in the amber glow of firelight, each lost in their own thoughts, yet somehow still connected. The silence between them comfortable now, companionable, in the way that only comes when people have traversed difficult territory together, and emerged intact on the other side. Lestrade stirred first, shifting in his chair with the small movements that precede departure, the physical acknowledgement that pleasant interludes must eventually end, that the world beyond Baker Street waited with its demands and obligations. Yet he didn't rise immediately, and Watson recognized the hesitation, the reluctance to leave this warm circle of safety for the cold uncertainty of streets still damp with rain and consequences still unresolved. "You know," Lestrade said quietly, his voice carrying a reflective quality that the brandy had perhaps unlocked, "I've been coming to Baker Street for years now, bringing you cases, asking for help, sometimes just seeking your opinion on matters that troubled me. And I realize that what I've learned here isn't just about detective work, about observation and deduction and following evidence." Holmes raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "It's about humility," Lestrade said simply, "about the courage to question your own certainties, to admit when you might have been wrong, to value truth over the comfort of being right. That's what you've taught me, Mr. Holmes. Not techniques or methods, though those too, but something deeper. The willingness to look at my own errors without flinching." Watson saw Holmes's expression shift, the sharp features softening into something approaching tenderness. His friend wasn't comfortable with sentiment, with emotional directness, but he recognized sincerity when he heard it, and Lestrade's words carried the weight of genuine gratitude. "You give me too much credit, Lestrade," Holmes said, and his voice was gentle, free of the sardonic edge he sometimes employed as defense against feeling. "You came here tonight already questioning yourself, already troubled by doubt. That capacity for self-reflection was yours, not something I instilled. I merely helped you examine what you'd already begun to suspect." "Perhaps," Lestrade allowed, "but you did more than that. You showed me that questioning a solved case isn't weakness, that uncertainty isn't failure. You reconstructed what might have happened with such clarity that now I can't unsee it, can't go back to my comfortable certainty that I'd handled things properly. And strangely, that's a gift. A painful one, but a gift nonetheless." The fire crackled softly, and Watson found himself thinking about gifts, about the strange ways that truth could wound and heal simultaneously. He'd experienced it in his medical practice, delivering diagnoses that shattered illusions, but also provided clarity, ended uncertainty, allowed patients to move forward even when the news was grim. Sometimes knowing, even knowing terrible things, was better than the limbo of ignorance. "What will you do?" Watson asked. "About Annie Fletcher, about the case, about all of it?" Lestrade was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'll look for her," he said finally, decision firming in his voice. "I'll use what resources I have at Scotland Yard to try to trace what became of her after she left the Ashworth household. Registry offices, workhouses, charity organizations, somewhere there might be a record, a trail. And if I find her, if she's alive and willing to speak with me, I'll tell her the truth. That she was wronged, that I failed her, that I'm sorry." "And if you don't find her?" Holmes asked quietly. "Then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll know I didn't simply file her away as a closed case and move on with my life, while she paid the price for my assumptions." Lestrade's hands tightened around his empty teacup. "And I'll look into Mrs. Penworth as well. Quietly, carefully, without raising official suspicion. If she's still alive, still in service somewhere, there might be a pattern. Other thefts, other accusations, other convenient scapegoats. If I can find evidence of a broader pattern of behavior, perhaps there's still something that can be done." Watson nodded approvingly. It wasn't full justice, perhaps, But it was accountability. It was a man facing his errors and attempting, however imperfectly, to make amends. That had to count for something. "I'll help with the search," Watson offered again. "I have time and medical connections that might prove useful. Hospital charity wards, for instance, or organizations that help women in difficult circumstances. If Annie Fletcher fell on hard times, and given her situation, she likely did, she might have passed through institutions that keep records. And I," Holmes added, "have my own network of informants and contacts throughout London's less respectable quarters. If Miss Fletcher survived without references, without prospects, she may have ended up in circumstances where official channels wouldn't track her, but the street-level intelligence I cultivate might. No promises, Lestrade, but I'll make inquiries." Lestrade looked between them, and Watson saw moisture gleaming in his eyes, quickly blinked away. "I don't deserve such support," he said roughly. "This is my failure to correct, my amends to make." "Nonsense," Watson said briskly, employing the practical tone that worked best against emotional displays threatening to overwhelm. "We're colleagues, friends even. Your failures are ours in a sense. We all participate in a system that too readily accepts convenient answers, that too easily dismisses the testimony of the powerless. If we can help right this wrong, or at least understand it better, then we should." The clock chimed 8:30, the sound marking time's steady progression, indifferent to human concerns, but somehow comforting in its regularity. Outside, the street had grown quiet, the rain's cessation leaving behind a hush that felt expectant, as if London itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what morning would bring. Holmes rose and crossed to the window one final time, looking down at Baker Street, where the gaslights created pools of amber warmth against the darkness. "You know what strikes me most about this whole affair?" he said, speaking to the glass, to the night, to them. "It's not the crime itself. Thefts happen, frames happen, the guilty escape justice every day. What strikes me is the casual cruelty of it. Mrs. Penworth, if our reconstruction is correct, looked at Annie Fletcher and saw not a person but a solution. A convenient answer to her problem, easily disposed of, eminently expendable." He turned to face them, and the firelight caught his profile, illuminating the sharp angles of his face, the intensity in his grey eyes. "That's what we fight against, isn't it? Not just crime, not just mystery, but the fundamental human capacity to treat other humans as means rather than ends, to sacrifice the vulnerable for the comfort of the powerful, to choose easy answers over truthful ones because truth demands too much of us." Watson felt the words settle into him, recognizing truth when he heard it. This was why he'd stayed at Baker Street all these years, why he'd given up a conventional medical practice to chronicle Holmes's cases, to participate in this strange vocation of pursuing justice in a world that seemed designed to thwart it. It wasn't about the intellectual puzzles, though those were engaging. It was about this, the recognition that every case involved real people, real consequences, real moral weight. 7 years ago, Lestrade said slowly, working through his thoughts as he spoke, I walked into the Ashworth household believing I was serving justice. I gathered evidence, drew conclusions, obtained a confession, recovered stolen property. By every conventional measure, I did my job well. The case was closed, the family satisfied, order restored, and yet And yet a girl's life was destroyed, Holmes finished softly, and the actual thief went free. And what appeared to be justice was actually its opposite, a mockery wearing justice's clothes. How do we prevent it? Lestrade asked, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. How do we ensure we're serving truth rather than convenience? Justice rather than the appearance of it? Holmes returned to his chair, settling into it with a sigh that suggested the weight of the question. I don't know that we can ensure it, he admitted, with the honesty he employed when questions mattered too much for false comfort. We're human, fallible, subject to bias and assumption and the limitations of our own perception. All we can do is remain vigilant, question relentlessly, refuse to accept easy answers just because they're easy. And when we discover we've erred, as we inevitably will, we must have the courage to acknowledge it and attempt to correct it. Even when correction is impossible, Lestrade pressed. Especially then, Watson said firmly, because impossible doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Because the attempt itself has value, demonstrates that we care about truth, even when truth can't undo harm. Because people like Annie Fletcher deserve to have their stories told truthfully, even if telling them truthfully can't restore what they've lost. The three men sat with that thought, letting it settle into the quiet room, become part of the evening's accumulating weight and wisdom. The fire had burned down to coals again, glowing red in the dimness, radiating heat that would last through the night, slow and steady and sure. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 9 o'clock, the sound carrying clearly through the rain-washed air, marking the hour with solemn regularity. Lestrade rose finally, truly ready to depart now. The brandy warm in his veins, the conversation carried as far as it could go for one evening. He retrieved his coat from where it had been drying by the fire, finding it stiff but no longer soaked, bearable for the journey home. Watson helped him into it, the small domestic gesture carrying affection and solidarity. "Thank you," Lestrade said again, and this time the words encompassed everything: the shelter from the rain, the tea and brandy, the patient reconstruction of an old case, the willingness to help seek truth, even when truth offered no guarantee of comfort. I came here seeking escape from the weather and perhaps from my own thoughts. I'm leaving with neither escape nor comfort, but something better, understanding, and the knowledge that I'm not alone in trying to make things right. You're never alone in that endeavour, Lestrade, Holmes said, extending his hand. They shook, the gesture formal but carrying genuine warmth. Come back when you've made progress with your inquiries, or before, if you simply need company. Baker Street is always here, and apparently we're rather good at talking through difficult matters over tea and tobacco. Watson walked Lestrade to the door, down the stairs where Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp burning low, anticipating their needs even in small things. At the threshold, the inspector paused, looking back up the stairs toward where Holmes waited, then at Watson. "He's extraordinary, you know," Lestrade said quietly. "Not just the mind, though that's formidable enough, but the compassion beneath the intellect. The way he cares about getting things right, about truth mattering, about people mattering. He hides it well, but it's there." "I know," Watson said, smiling. "I've known it for years. It's why I stay, why I write about his cases, why I consider it an honour to call him friend." Lestrade nodded, satisfied. "Good. He's fortunate to have you, Doctor. You ground him, remind him of the human element in all his equations. Don't ever doubt the value of that contribution. And then he was gone, stepping out into the night, where the streets gleamed wet under gaslight, and London sprawled vast and complicated in every direction, full of stories untold and mysteries unsolved, and people struggling through their lives with whatever courage they could muster. The door closed behind him, and Watson stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, listening to the inspector's footsteps fade into the distance, swallowed by the city's endless noise and motion. When he returned upstairs, Holmes was standing at the window again, watching Lestrade's figure recede down Baker Street, becoming smaller, and then vanishing around a corner, absorbed into London's endless streams of humanity. Watson joined him, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down at their street, their city, their complicated, beautiful, frustrating world. "Do you think we'll find her?" Watson asked quietly. "Annie Fletcher?" "I don't know," Holmes replied honestly. 7 years is a long time for someone in her circumstances. The statistics are not encouraging. Young women without resources, without protection, without references. London consumes them daily. She may be dead. She may be so broken by what happened that she won't want to revisit it. She may have reinvented herself entirely, built a new life, and have no desire to excavate the past. But we'll look. But we'll look, Holmes confirmed. Because Lestrade needs to try, and because it's the right thing to do, and because somewhere in this vast city there might be a woman who deserves to know that someone finally questioned the narrative that destroyed her. That someone cared enough to seek the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient and late and unable to restore what was taken. They stood together in silence, watching the street, watching the night, companions in this strange vocation they'd chosen, or that had chosen them. The fire behind them settled into its final configuration of the evening, coals arranging themselves into patterns that would last until morning, slow burning and patient. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind the clean scent of washed stone and the particular quality of quiet that follows storms, when the world feels renewed, ready to begin again. "You know what I think?" Watson said finally, surprising himself with the observation that had been forming throughout the evening. "I think the greatest detective work isn't solving mysteries. It's having the courage to question solutions, to admit when we've gotten things wrong, to keep seeking truth, even when we've already decided we've found it. That's what Lestrade showed us tonight. Not weakness, but strength. The kind of strength that matters most." Holmes turned from the window, and Watson saw something in his friend's expression that might have been pride or affection or simply recognition of truth spoken plain. "My dear Watson," he said softly, "you've always understood the heart of things better than you give yourself credit for. Yes, that's exactly right. The courage to question, to doubt, to remain uncertain in the service of truth. That's the real work. Everything else is just technique." They returned to their chairs one final time, settling in not to talk, but simply to exist together in the warm, quiet room, the day's obligations met, the evening's revelations processed as well as they could be for now. The fire glowed its approval, the clock ticked its steady rhythm, and somewhere in the house, Mrs. Hudson moved about her final preparations for night, the familiar sounds a lullaby of domestic security. Outside, London settled into its own sleep, or the approximation of it that great cities achieve, never truly still, never completely dark, but quieter, softer, the daytime urgency giving way to evening's gentler pace. In the bedrooms throughout the vast sprawl, people laid themselves down to rest, carrying their own burdens, their own questions, their own hopes, that morning might bring answers, or at least the strength to continue seeking them. And in 221B Baker Street, two men sat by firelight and contemplated the weight of stories, the cost of assumptions, the value of companionship, and the strange comfort that comes from acknowledging failure as the first step toward wisdom. The rain had brought Lestrade to their door, seeking shelter. It had given them instead understanding, had washed away the comfortable certainty of a case solved 7 years ago, and revealed the uncomfortable truth beneath. But truth, however uncomfortable, was what they served, what they'd always served. And as the fire burned down to its final embers and the night deepened around them, there was peace in that commitment, in knowing that they would look for Annie Fletcher, would pursue truth wherever it led, would remain vigilant against the human tendency to choose convenience over conscience. The rain on Baker Street had stopped, but its work was done. It had brought them together, had created the conditions for revelation, had washed the city clean and left behind this. 3 men committed to seeking truth, to questioning certainty, to remembering that every case involved real people with real lives that could be destroyed by assumptions left unexamined. And that, Watson thought as the clock struck 10 and the fire settled into glowing silence, that was perhaps the best any of them could hope to achieve. Not perfection, not infallibility, but the determination to keep trying, keep questioning, keep caring about getting it right, even when right seemed impossible to reach. The evening drew to its close. Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across strings in a melody too soft to be called music, too intentional to be called noise. Just sound, just beauty, just the acoustic expression of thought, too complex for words. Watson listened, eyes closing, the day's accumulated weight settling into something bearable, something he could carry forward into tomorrow. And Baker Street held them both, as it always had, as it always would, a refuge from rain and doubt and the terrible weight of understanding, a place where questions could be asked and truth pursued, and companionship offered freely to any who came seeking shelter from the storm. The last ember glowed, faded, went dark. The rain's work was complete.